November 14, 1965, landing zone X-ray, Drang Valley, Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 10:48 in the morning. The pen barely moved as First Lieutenant James Riley scribbled in his field notebook, his hands still trembling from the firefight that had erupted moments after the helicopters departed. The rifle in my hands just saved my life. But I watched 3 men die today because theirs would not fire. Through the elephant grass and triple canopy jungle, approximately 14 miles west of Plamy Camp, American soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile had just experienced their first major battle against regular North Vietnamese Army forces. 450 men of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry had been inserted by helicopter into a clearing at the base of the Chapong Massif. Within minutes of landing, they had made contact with elements of the North Vietnamese Army's 66th Regiment. What would become a 3-day battle had begun. The new M16 rifle rushed into production and shipped to Vietnam with promises of revolutionary firepower had performed flawlessly for some units. For others, it had failed catastrophically. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger one of the most devastating equipment failures in American military history. A systematic collapse of trust between soldiers and their primary weapon that would cost hundreds of lives before congressional intervention forced urgent reforms. The mathematics of this tragedy were being written not in battle plans, but in jam rates, powder specifications, and chrome plating decisions that had prioritized cost savings over soldier survival. The crisis had begun not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the boardrooms of the Pentagon and the production facilities of American defense contractors. The weapon that would become the M16 started its life as the Armalite AR-15, designed in the late 1950s by Eugene Stoner. Born in 1922, Stoner had served as a Marine in the South Pacific during World War II and later worked as a machinist and design engineer. His revolutionary approach to rifle design challenged every assumption about military weapons. The AR-15 was first revealed at Fort Benning, Georgia in May 1957. This lightweight rifle, weighing just 6.37 pounds compared to the M14's 9.2 pounds, fired a small caliber 5.56 millimeters round at extremely high velocity. The cartridge itself, based on the commercial to 123 Remington round, pushed a 55-grain bullet at over 3,000 feet per. Early tests with Special Forces units in 1962 showed remarkable results. The rifle's light recoil allowed soldiers to maintain accurate fire even in full automatic mode. High ammunition capacity meant soldiers could carry 300 rounds in the same weight as 180 rounds of 7.62. 2,000 ammunition for the M14. The devastating, wounding capability of the high-velocity round made it ideal for the close-quarters jungle combat of Southeast Asia. Air Force security police units adopted the rifle enthusiastically and reported excellent results. But between those promising early trials and full-scale deployment lay a series of decisions that would transform a revolutionary weapon into a death trap. In January 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara concluded the AR-15 was superior to the M14 and ordered a halt to M14 production. In November 1963, he approved orders for 85,000 XM16E1s. Overriding objections from Army brass who remained loyal to the heavier M14, production began in March 1964. The decision was driven partly by cost, partly by the urgent need for weapons suited to Vietnam's unique combat environment, and partly by McNamara's faith in systems analysis and modern technology over traditional military thinking. The rifle McNamara ordered, however, was not the rifle that had performed so well in early testing. The changes began with the ammunition. Eugene Stoner had designed the AR-15 to fire cartridges loaded with IMR-447-5, a stick powder manufactured by DuPont. This powder produced specific pressures and a cyclic rate of fire around 800 rounds per minute. The combination had been carefully engineered to work with the rifle's direct gas impingement system, where propellant gases were channeled directly back into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. In March 1964, Dupin informed the Army that it could not mass-produce IMR-447-5 to meet the demanded specifications and timeline. The powder worked perfectly in small controlled batches, producing consistent velocities and pressures, but scaling up to produce millions of rounds while maintaining lotto consistency proved impossible. The extruded stick powder required precise control of temperature, humidity, and cutting processes. Even minor variations between batches could affect chamber pressures and velocities. The Army needed millions of rounds immediately for Vietnam deployment. DuPont could not deliver. The Army needed an alternative immediately. Ulan Mat Company stepped forward with WC-846, a bull propellant already in use for 7.6 to 6 mm NATO ammunition. Bull powder used an entirely different manufacturing process. The nitric cellulose was dissolved in solvents, formed into tiny spheres, and then hardened. This process was faster, more consistent, and much easier to scale up to mass production. A batch of WC-846 could be manufactured in 40 hours compared to 2 weeks for IMR-447-5. More importantly, Ulan Mat could guarantee a delivery of the enormous quantities the Army required. The Army and Ulan Mat both understood that. WC-846 burned differently than IMR-447-5. The bull powder generated higher peak pressures and maintained those pressures longer as the bullet traveled down the barrel. This produced higher port pressures at the gas port location. The increased gas pressure meant more propellant gas was diverted back through the gas tube into the bolt carrier. This increased the violence of the action cycling and raised the cyclic rate of fire from around 800 rounds per minute to between 850 and 1,000 rounds per minute. More critically, WC-846 contained calcium carbonate as a stabilizer and deterrent coating. The calcium carbonate helped control the burn rate of the powder, but left significantly more fouling residue than IMR-447-5 in traditional rifle designs with gas piston systems. This increased fouling went into the gas piston and could be cleaned from outside the action. But the M16 used direct gas impingement. Every bit of that calcium carbonate residue was blown directly back into the bolt carrier, the bolt, and most critically the chamber itself, with every single shot fired. Crucially, no one conducted extensive testing of the M16 with WC-846 ammunition before approving the change. The rifle had been tested and approved with IMR-447-5. The ammunition change was treated as a simple substitution rather than a fundamental alteration to the weapons system. Army acceptance tests continued using remaining stocks of IMR-447-5 loaded ammunition, even as millions of rounds of W-846 ammunition were being produced for shipment to Vietnam. The second critical decision involved chrome plating. Eugene Stoner and the cult engineers who manufactured the rifle strongly recommended chrome plating the chamber and bore. This was not a new or experimental technology. Chrome plating had been used in artillery barrels since World War I and in aircraft machine guns throughout World War II. The process involved electroplating a thin layer of chromium onto the steel surface, creating a hard corrosion-resistant finish. Chrome plating would protect against corrosion in Vietnam's humid jungle environment and would help prevent cartridge cases from sticking in the chamber during extraction. The United States military had extensive experience with tropical corrosion from the Pacific theater of World War II. Weapons that performed flawlessly in temperate climates had corroded rapidly in the humidity of Pacific Islands. Chrome plating had been identified as the solution decades earlier. The Army rejected this recommendation. Chrome plating added cost and production time to each rifle. Each chamber had to be carefully prepared, plated in an electroplating bath, and then inspected. The process added several steps to the manufacturing timeline. More importantly, traditionalists and Army ordnance worried that chrome plating would affect accuracy. Some target shooters believed that chrome-plated barrels were less accurate than bare steel, though testing had never confirmed this belief for military-grade accuracy standards. The decision was made to produce rifles without chrome-plated chambers despite warnings from the manufacturer. The Army cited the expense as cost-prohibitive, though no official documentation specifies the exact savings per rifle. Army ordnance believed that proper maintenance would prevent corrosion problems. This belief would prove catastrophically wrong in Vietnam's climate and combat conditions. The third decision would prove equally catastrophic. Colt had advertised the M16 as requiring minimal maintenance, far less than the M14. This was true when firing ammunition loaded with IMR 4-7.5 in controlled conditions. Marketing materials and some early briefings describe the rifle as nearly self-cleaning. The Army took this characterization at face value and failed to provide adequate cleaning equipment or training to troops deploying to Vietnam. Soldiers received their new M16s with virtually no cleaning kits, no instruction on proper maintenance procedures, and often with explicit statements that the rifle required little to no cleaning. Many were told the weapon was self-cleaning and that attempting to clean it improperly might damage it. This guidance would prove lethal when combined with the fouling properties of WC8-6 powder and the lack of chrome plating in the chamber. The fourth modification compounded the emerging disaster. The original AR-15 lacked a forward assist, a device to manually ram the bolt fully forward if it failed to close on its own. Eugene Stoner had deliberately omitted this feature, reasoning that if the bolt would not close easily, something was wrong and the soldier should clear the malfunction rather than force it. Army Ordnance insisted on adding a forward assist, arguing that soldiers needed the ability to force the rifle into battery. This seemingly minor change would later become a symbol of the systemic problems. Soldiers using the forward assist, desperately trying to close bolts on chambers already fouled beyond function. The first M16s arrived in Vietnam in early 1965. Initial issue went to elite units, Special Forces, Airborne, and the 1st Cavalry Division. These early deployments mostly used remaining stocks of IMR 4-7.5 loaded ammunition and included soldiers who received better training and maintained their weapons meticulously. Reports from these units were largely positive. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry carried M16s into the Drang Valley in November 1965. Moore, a West Point graduate and combat veteran of the Korean War, commanded for 150 men organized into 4 rifle companies. They deployed aboard 16 UH-1D Huey helicopters landing in waves at Landing Zone Xray. The landing zone was a clearing approximately 100 yards wide at the eastern base of the Chupong Masi, a mountain that rose to 4,400 feet and marked the border with Cambodia. Within 15 minutes of the first helicopter touching down, Moore's troops made contact with North Vietnamese forces. What followed was a desperate 3-day battle against elements of 3 North Vietnamese regiments, perhaps 2,000 enemy soldiers. The fighting was often at point-blank range, sometimes hand-to-hand. North Vietnamese forces launched human wave assaults. American soldiers fired their M16s on full automatic, burning through magazine after magazine. In that first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, the M16 performed remarkably well for most soldiers. The rifle's high rate of fire and lightweight ammunition allowed troops to carry significantly more rounds than they could have with M14s. Lieutenant Colonel Moore had ordered his men to carry as much ammunition as possible. Many soldiers carried 300 to 400 rounds. In the desperate close quarters fighting that characterized Drang, this ammunition capacity proved decisive. American firepower combined with artillery support and tactical airstrikes prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the landing zone. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who fought in the battle, later described the experience. "I did not run out of ammunition. I had about 30 magazines in my pack and no problems with the M16. Savage's platoon held a critical position on the perimeter throughout the battle. The M16s functioned as designed, but earring represented the best-case scenario for the M16. These were well-trained soldiers of an elite airmobile division. They had received better instruction on the new rifle than conventional infantry units would receive later. They maintained their weapons carefully. Most critically, many of the rifles at Drang were still using ammunition loaded with IMR 447 powder, the propellant the rifle had been designed to use. The weapons were relatively new, with chambers not yet corroded. The chaos of battle and the success of the engagement masked early warning signs of the problems that would emerge months later. As 1966 progressed and hundreds of thousands of M16s flooded into Vietnam, loaded exclusively with WC-846 ammunition and issued to conventional infantry units with minimal training, the crisis began to unfold. By mid-1966, reports started filtering back from Vietnam that the M16 was failing at catastrophic rates. Soldiers wrote desperate letters home describing rifles that jammed after firing just a few rounds. Officers filed official complaints stating that their men had lost confidence in their primary weapon. Medical evacuation helicopters brought back wounded men who reported their rifles had failed at the moment they needed them most. The failures followed a predictable and deadly pattern. After firing 10 to 20 rounds, especially in full automatic mode, the rifle would fail to extract the spent cartridge case. The sequence of the malfunction became grimly familiar to soldiers throughout Vietnam. The soldier would pull the trigger. The rifle would fire. The action would cycle. The bolt carrier driven backward by gas pressure. The extractor would attempt to pull the spent cartridge case from the chamber, but the case would stick, gripped by the corroded chamber walls and sealed by powder residue. The extractor, a small hook-shaped piece of spring steel, would pull against the rim of the brass case. The soft brass would deform under the pressure. The extractor would tear through the rim, leaving the body of the cartridge wedged firmly in the chamber. The bolt carrier would cycle backward, ejecting only the torn brass rim. A fresh round would be stripped from the magazine and pushed forward by the bolt. But the bolt could not close. The chamber still contained the body of the previous cartridge case. The fresh round would jam against the stuck case. The action would be completely locked. The soldier would pull the trigger and hear only a click. The hammer had fallen on a firing pin that could not reach the primer because the bolt was not fully closed. At this point, the rifle was completely inoperable. No amount of manipulation of the charging handle or forward assist would clear the malfunction. The only way to clear this type of jam was to insert a cleaning rod down the barrel from the muzzle end and punch the stuck case backward out of the chamber. This required removing the magazine, locking the bolt to the rear, inserting a cleaning rod down the 20-in barrel, and forcefully driving the stuck case out through the ejection port. But soldiers had not been issued cleaning rods. The rifle had been described as self-cleaning and requiring minimal maintenance. Cleaning kits, when they existed at all, were typically kept at base camps, not carried on patrol. Even if a soldier had been issued a cleaning rod, performing this clearance procedure under fire was virtually impossible. It required using both hands, taking at least 30 seconds, even for an experienced soldier, and left the soldier completely unable to defend himself. In a firefight where the enemy might be 10 feet away in thick jungle, 30 seconds without a functioning weapon was a death sentence. Marine Corporal John Stevens wrote home in June 1966, "Out of 40 rounds I fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar jungle knife, so I will have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a 1 1/4" paintbrush. I need it. Our rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jam so easily." The desperation in such letters reflects a soldier's worst nightmare. Fighting in dense jungle where the enemy could be 5 feet away, where contact happened without warning, where survival depended on immediate, overwhelming firepower, and discovering that your rifle would fire 5 rounds and then become a useless club. October 1966, the commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry, 1st Infantry Division filed an official report. The new M16 rifles are experiencing malfunctions to the extent that confidence has been degraded. His battalion had lost men in firefights when their rifles failed. Troops were beginning to pick up enemy AK-47 rifles from dead North Vietnamese soldiers, weapons they knew would fire reliably even when covered in mud. The AK-47 became the M16's devastating counterpoint. Designed in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Kalashnikov and adopted in 1947, the AK used a fundamentally different operating system. The AK employed a long-stroke gas piston. When the rifle fired, propellant gas was tapped from the barrel through a gas port, but instead of being channeled back into the bolt carrier as in the M16. The gas drove a long piston that was physically separate from the bolt carrier. The piston pushed the bolt carrier backward. Then the piston returned forward while the bolt carrier continued cycling. This meant propellant gas and fouling never entered the action. All the combustion residue stayed in the gas tube and piston, completely separate from the bolt and chamber. The AK was also built with loose tolerances that allowed it to function when dirty, wet, or corroded. The bolt had significant clearance inside the receiver. Dirt and debris simply fell out through gaps in the design. The magazine was curved and designed to feed reliably even when dented or dirty. Every part of the weapon prioritized reliability over precision. Mikhail Kalashnikov had designed the weapon based on his experience as a Soviet tank commander in World War II. He knew that soldiers in combat conditions could not maintain weapons carefully. He designed a rifle that would work regardless of how badly it was treated. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters maintained their AK-47s poorly, if at all. Weapons were stored in underground caches where they were exposed to water, mud, and humidity for months. They were carried through rivers, dropped in rice paddies, buried when units retreated. Yet the weapons functioned with near-perfect reliability. An AK could be pulled from a muddy stream. The bolt cycled once to clear water from the action and the weapon would fire. American soldiers began to notice the contrast immediately. "We found a case that had been buried in mud, dropped in rivers, left in the jungle for weeks," wrote Sergeant William Rodriguez. "We picked them up, pulled the bolt back, and they fired. Our M16s jammed if you looked at them wrong." The contrast became a bitter joke among infantry units. The enemy had better rifles than we did. The underground market for captured AK-47s flourished. Officially, carrying enemy weapons was prohibited by regulations. American ammunition was not compatible with the AK, and carrying enemy weapons could lead to friendly fire incidents if a soldier was mistaken for the enemy. Unofficially, many squad leaders allowed or even encouraged their men to carry captured AKs. Some soldiers carried both an M16 and an AK, using the American rifle until it jammed and then switching to the Soviet weapon. A functioning AK was better than a jammed M16. Soldiers understood this, even if Army regulations did not. The first official acknowledgement of the crisis came too slowly. Reports of malfunctions reached General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Westmoreland found himself in an impossible position. He had personally requested 100,000 M16s for Vietnam, praising the rifle as ideal for jungle warfare. He had visited units at Ia Drang shortly after the battle and heard positive reports about the weapon. He believed the rifle was a significant improvement over the M14 for the type of combat American forces faced in Southeast Asia, yet soldiers under his command were writing home that the M16 was getting them killed. The complaints could not be ignored, but acknowledging the problem meant admitting a massive failure in weapons procurement. In December 1966, the Marine Corps conducted a formal survey of 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. After a series of engagements where rifle failures had caused casualties, the battalion had been involved in Operation Prairie, heavy fighting in the demilitarized zone near the North Vietnamese border. The survey was devastating. Approximately 80% of troops surveyed reported experiencing stoppages during combat operations. Many reported their rifles jamming after firing fewer than 10 rounds. Several Marines stated they had been wounded or seen fellow Marines killed because rifles failed during contact with the enemy. Some Marines reported firing only 3 or 4 rounds before experiencing complete weapon failure. The survey documented the types of malfunctions. Failure to extract was by far the most common, accounting for 80% of all stoppages. Failure to feed, where a fresh cartridge would not chamber properly, accounted for most of the remainder. Failure to fire, where the firing pin failed to ignite the primer, was relatively rare. The extraction failures followed the pattern that would become grimly familiar. The rifle would fire several rounds, then a cartridge case would stick in the chamber. The extractor would tear through the case rim. The rifle would be completely jammed. The survey included the most damning evidence yet. The Court Committee investigation later confirmed that one Marine corporal had been killed while running up and down the line of his squad trying to unjam other Marines' rifles with his cleaning rod. He was the only member of his squad who had managed to obtain a cleaning rod, apparently by trading with another unit. During a firefight, multiple Marines in the squad experienced extraction failures simultaneously. The corporal moved from position to position, using his cleaning rod to punch stuck cases out of chambers while under fire. He was shot and killed while clearing a jam from another Marine's rifle. His own rifle, functioning properly, was found next to his body. He had died trying to keep his squad in the fight. By early 1967, the stories were reaching the American public. Soldiers' letters home describing rifle failures began appearing in newspapers. One Marine officer wrote, "Senator Gaylord Nelson, the weapon has failed us at crucial moments. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles." Another letter from a Marine stated simply, "You know what killed most of us? Our own rifles, the M16. Families who had lost sons in Vietnam demanded to know if inadequate equipment had contributed to their deaths." On March 26, 1967, the Washington Daily News broke a major story about M16 reliability problems, featuring interviews with returning soldiers and excerpts from letters sent home from Vietnam. The article created a political firestorm. How could American troops be sent into combat with defective rifles? Why had the problems not been identified and corrected before widespread deployment? Who was responsible for decisions that prioritized cost and production speed over soldier safety? The pressure became impossible for Congress to ignore. On May 3, 1967, Representative L. Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services, established a special subcommittee to investigate the M16 rifle program. Congressman Richard Dickard, Democrat of Missouri, was appointed chairman of the subcommittee. He was joined by Representative Speedy Long of Louisiana and Representative William G. Bray of Indiana. The Court Committee, as it became known, would conduct the most thorough investigation of a weapons procurement program in congressional history over the next 5 months. The committee held hearings on May 15th, 16th, and 31st, June 21st, July 25th, 26th, and 27th, and August 8th, 9th, and 22nd. All hearings were conducted at the Rayburn House Office Building in Washington. The committee interviewed hundreds of witnesses, from combat soldiers recently returned from Vietnam to Army generals, from cult engineers to ammunition manufacturers, from Eugene Stoner himself to Pentagon procurement officials. Testimony was given under oath. Documents were subpoenaed. Technical experts were brought in to explain the ballistics and engineering involved. The committee examined every aspect of the M16 program. They reviewed procurement decisions going back to 1963. They analyzed test reports that had been filed and ignored. They studied engineering drawings and manufacturing specifications. They interviewed soldiers who had survived firefights where their rifles failed. They brought in weapons that had been recovered from casualties, rifles found next to dead Americans with stuck cases still in the chambers. The picture that emerged was devastating. Every decision that had transformed the reliable AR-15 into the failing M16 was documented in detail. The switch from IMR4-7.5 to WC8-6 powder without adequate testing. The rejection of chrome plating despite manufacturer recommendations. The failure to provide cleaning equipment or training. The misleading claims about the rifle being self-cleaning. The increased cyclic rate that accelerated fouling, the quality control problems at Colt that allowed rifles to be shipped with defective parts. Each failure was documented with technical data engineering reports. And the testimony of soldiers who had paid the price. The committee discovered that multiple people had raised red flags about these issues before widespread deployment. Colt engineers had protested the ammunition change in writing. Company officials had stated explicitly that they could not guarantee weapon performance with the new powder. Eugene Stoner had recommended chrome plating in his original design specifications and had reiterated this recommendation when the Army began large-scale procurement. Air Force officers who had used the rifle successfully with proper ammunition and maintenance had emphasized the need for cleaning equipment and training. Test reports had shown increased malfunction rates with WC8-6 ammunition. All of these warnings had been ignored, dismissed, or buried in the urgency to get rifles to Vietnam and the desire to cut costs. The most damning revelation concerned who knew what and when. Army Ordnance had test data showing that WC8-6 ammunition caused increased malfunction rates. They had reports from Colt stating that the company could not guarantee rifle performance with WC8-6. They knew that rifles without chrome plating corroded in humid environments. They knew that soldiers were not receiving adequate training or cleaning equipment. Yet deployment had continued month after month while soldiers died because their rifles failed. The testimony of returned combat veterans proved particularly powerful. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez testified about a firefight where his rifle jammed after the third round. He described using his jammed rifle as a club, suffering a bayonet wound, and watching his fire team leader die while trying to clear his own jammed rifle. Private First Class David Chen described finding a dead American patrol. All 7 men killed, all 7 M16s jammed, cleaning rods scattered around the bodies where the men had died trying to clear their weapons. Eugene Stoner explained his design philosophy for the committee. The AR-15 was engineered as a complete weapon system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures all worked together. Changing the ammunition without extensive testing broke the system. He had recommended chrome plating specifically because he knew the direct gas impingement system would be vulnerable to corrosion without it. He had never claimed the rifle was self-cleaning. That characterization had been invented by marketing departments and repeated by people who did not understand the weapon. Ballistics experts testified about the differences between IMR4-7.5 and WC8-6. The ball powder produced higher port pressures that increased the volume of gas and residue blown into the action. The calcium carbonate in WC8-6 created fouling that IMR4-7.5 did not. The increased cyclic rate meant more rounds fired before a soldier could react to a malfunction, leading to worse jams. All of this had been predictable, some of it had been predicted. The predictions had been ignored. Representatives from Colt testified that they had raised concerns about the ammunition change. They stated in writing that they could not guarantee rifle performance with WC8-6 and that the increased cyclic rate violated Army acceptance standards. The Army had granted waivers allowing the higher cyclic rate. Quality control inspectors testified about finding defects in rifles being shipped to Vietnam. Bolt carriers with improper hardness that would crack under stress. Extractors with weak springs that would fail to pull stuck cases. They had rejected these rifles. The rejections had been overruled in the urgency to meet production quotas. The financial testimony exposed another dimension of the scandal. The decision to use W8-6 had saved money. Ball powder was cheaper and faster to produce than stick powder. Matson had made substantial profits from ammunition contracts. The decision not to chrome plate chambers had saved production costs. While the committee found no evidence of outright corruption or bribery, the cozy relationships between military procurement officers and defense contractors had clearly affected decision-making. Cost considerations and production convenience had outweighed combat effectiveness and soldier safety. The I-Court Committee report and aftermath. By August 1967, the I-Court Committee had assembled an overwhelming case. The M16 failures were not the result of soldier incompetence or inadequate training alone. They were the result of systematic failures in weapons procurement, testing, and deployment. Multiple officials and organizations shared responsibility. The committee's formal report, released on October 19, 1967, contained extensive findings and recommendations. The switch to ball-powder ammunition was identified as the primary cause of malfunctions. The lack of chrome plating in the chamber was the secondary cause. The failure to provide adequate cleaning equipment and training was the tertiary cause. The report recommended immediate action: chrome plate all M16 chambers and bores. Develop improved ammunition with reduced fouling characteristics. Provide extensive cleaning kits to all troops carrying M16s. Implement comprehensive training programs on proper maintenance. Modify the rifle to reduce the cyclic rate. Establish better quality control and production. Create accountability for procurement decisions that affected soldier safety. The M16A1 fix. The investigation generated enough political pressure that the Army could not continue its previous course. Changes began immediately, even before the final report was released. The Army had already begun standardizing the improved M16E1 as the M16A1. Production of the improved rifle ramped up rapidly throughout the spring and summer. The M16A1 incorporated critical modifications that addressed every major failure point. Chrome plating. The chamber and bore were chrome plated, eliminating the corrosion problems that caused cases to stick. Extraction failures dropped dramatically, reduced cyclic rate. A new buffer assembly reduced the cyclic rate from over 900 rounds per minute back down to between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. Improved training and kits. The self-cleaning myth was explicitly and publicly debunked. Field Manual 23-9 was completely rewritten with detailed cleaning instructions. Comprehensive cleaning kits were manufactured and distributed throughout Vietnam. Soldiers were required to clean their rifles daily in combat conditions, and a dirty rifle was treated as a serious offense. Comic book-style manuals were produced showing soldiers exactly how to maintain their rifles. Ammunition change. In 1970, a new powder designated WC8 for 4 replaced WC8 for 6 for 5.56 mm ammunition. WC844 had reduced calcium carbonate content, producing significantly less fouling. The results were dramatic. By late 1967 and early 1968, units equipped with M16A1 South proper cleaning equipment and adequate training reported substantial improvements in reliability. Malfunction rates dropped to levels comparable to or better than other military rifles. Soldiers who had despised and feared the M16 began to trust it. The rifle's inherent advantages could finally be realized without the crippling reliability problems. With chrome-plated chambers, proper cleaning, and improved ammunition, the M16A1 became the weapon it should have been from the beginning. In early 1968, the Army conducted comprehensive surveys of troops in Vietnam. The surveys were designed to measure soldier confidence in the improved rifle and identify any remaining problems. Results showed overwhelming satisfaction. The vast majority reported the rifle functioned reliably in combat. Most soldiers reported no significant malfunctions during the previous month of operations. When malfunctions did occur, they were typically minor feeding issues that could be cleared quickly, not the catastrophic extraction failures that had killed men a year earlier. The February 1968 Department of Defense survey of 2,100 soldiers and Marines found that only 38 individuals, less than 2%, stated they wanted to replace the M16 with a different weapon. An August to September 1967 survey found that 85% of respondents reported the M16 performed well in combat. A January to February 1968 survey found that 85% of troops wanted either the M16 or the M177 for combat operations. The transformation was complete. A weapon that had been called a death trap that soldiers had refused to carry, that men had died cursing, had become trusted and effective. The same basic design, when properly implemented with appropriate ammunition, chrome plating, cleaning equipment, and training, proved to be an excellent combat rifle. The human cost and lasting legacy human cost of the delay was incalculable. No one knows exactly how many American soldiers died because their M16s jammed during firefights. The number was certainly in the hundreds, possibly more. Each death was preventable. Each resulted from decisions made in offices thousands of miles from Vietnam. Decisions that prioritized production speed and cost savings over soldier survival. The psychological cost was equally severe. Soldiers lost faith not just in their rifles but in the institution that had sent them into combat with defective equipment. The M16 scandal became a symbol of everything wrong with the Vietnam War. Hasty decisions, inadequate testing, prioritization of systems and statistics over human realities, and the disconnect between leadership and troops in the field. Systemic reforms. Them 16A1 served throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War with increasing success. The rifle continued to evolve through the M16, A2, A3, A4, and eventually the M4 carbine, serving American forces for over 50 years. The legacy of the M16 crisis shaped military procurement for decades. Congressional oversight. The ICOR committees investigation established precedents for congressional oversight of weapons programs that continue today. Before the M16 scandal, procurement had been largely an internal military matter. The investigation changed this fundamentally, institutionalized soldier feedback. The concept of soldier feedback became institutionalized. The opinions of ordinary soldiers who would actually carry the weapons into combat were no longer dismissed. The Army established formal mechanisms for troops to report equipment problems, such as the Product Quality Deficiency Report System. The voice of the soldier in the field gained authority it had never possessed before. Mandatory operational testing. Operational testing in combat conditions became mandatory before full-scale deployment of new weapons. The practice of adopting a weapon based solely on laboratory testing ended. Tighter procurement regulations. Procurement regulations were tightened to prevent the kinds of waivers and shortcuts that had caused the M16 disaster. The casual granting of waivers that had allowed defective M16s to be shipped to Vietnam became much more difficult. Rigorous quality control. Government inspectors gained more authority to reject defective weapons, and the practice of overruling inspector rejections to meet production quotas was forbidden. The fundamental lesson was learned. A weapons system must be tested as a complete system. Changing one component affects the entire system. Cost savings that compromise reliability are not savings at all when measured in lives lost. The M16 succeeded in the long run, not because it was perfectly designed, but because when it failed, the failure was not covered up or ignored. The men who carried M16s in Vietnam, particularly those who served in 1966 and 67 when the problems were worst, deserve recognition not just for their combat service, but for their persistence with defective equipment. Their complaints eventually triggered the investigation that fixed the system. The tragedy was preventable. The triumph was earned. Together, they taught lessons that shaped American military procurement for generations.